Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Wellman with HIMS TV. Today, we're speaking with Atif Chagtai, healthcare market leader with Red Hat. Atif, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be back.
Yeah, great to have you as always. First of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about uh, this. How does Red Hat define clinical reasoning?
Yeah, so clinical reasoning is actually a well-defined space. Our viewpoint on that is taking your typical clinical decision support system, which is supposed to help in diagnostic and reminders, and taking some of the AI ML from a clinical reasoning side, which is looking through the data and essentially providing analysis, putting them together. That if you think about a Venn diagram, that intersection of these two is that where we fit in. We actually use clinical reasoning as a continuous improvement, continuous learning paradigm, where we are taking the learnings from AI ML models, contextualizing it with rules engine to look for things like bias, situational awareness, and interjecting it into the clinical or any workflows engaging with patients or members.
Great. And speaking of AI, what is the role of AI, ML, and what is the opportunity for it in the future?
AI ML, the best way for me to describe it is any activity that requires processing of data and then analyzing that data and acting upon it. That's where it's suited very, very well. So think about images, clinical or face recognition type of technologies, even MRIs, right? Those are some of the areas where we see a lot of advancement in using AI ML based to look for COVID through the chest X-rays,
Mhm.
look for lung cancer or other things using the X-rays. And that aspect of AI ML, where you are now processing a lot of data and quickly able to identify patterns, that's really where I see a lot of progress being made. In future, I think everybody feels the challenge of bias from the algorithm and how to make sure that you are taking those away is where we'll see advancement in other areas that are less so data relevant, but more so signal driven. So when I mean signal is like patterns of, somebody headed towards sepsis. And we have customers and organizations that use AI ML models to look for those signals in the data in the clinical hospital setting and identify patient like 3 hours ahead of a typical diagnosis that the patient is getting sepsis.
Interesting. Where are most organizations today in this journey?
So we actually conducted a recent roundtable discussion with some of the healthcare leaders in the country, and a specific topic was AI ML. And one of the area that everyone prioritized and identified is around AI ops. AI ops is actually the working with the AI ML. How do you do continuous experiment, continuous improvement on those AI models? How do you take them from design palette to actual operational palette and then be able to continuously operate on them? That's where most of the customers right now are trying to streamline that process.
And what are some of the critical steps some organization should consider if they're just getting started on this journey, or if, to your point, they're rethinking their approach about how AI fits in their workflows?
So I think the critical steps for any organizations are as follows. Number one, you need to have a environment where your data scientists and your AI ML team is able to continuously do experiments. AI is, from a traditional software development model, if you think about it, like it's agile, but it's extremely agile. Continuously doing various different experiments to fine tune and refine. So I would say, making sure that there is a environment that allows your team to be able to perform those duties. Also look at open source. There's a lot of open source, Red Hat being, a very big participant of these open source communities, I get to see a lot of these open source based AI ML technologies that exist where barrier to entry into them is very low. When I mean barrier to entry is the adoption and getting started with it is very low. You don't have to procure those technologies. You don't have to get the other aspects of bringing a technology into an organization. You could use a cloud-based environment, grab that open source community-based AI ML technology and examples that have been built out there to help start this journey of AI ML. The second aspect is actually also building an AI ML community within your organization, so where people can now share the lessons learned and best practices. Third, I will say think about also the areas around data. How do you make sure the data that you have provided, it represents a good segment and it's not biased in any way? And how do you continuously evolve that data? So those three strategies from environment, open source, and building a community like open source within organization, and then having a data strategy is where I would say start to focus.
Great. And let's drill into the open source piece for just a second. What is the value of open source?
Open source is essentially a catalyst of any innovation that is taking place in the industry. Open source brings a culture of collaboration, transparency, shareability, and common vision. That culture, those attributes are essentially what makes these open source projects excel and accelerate. Because you have now many different points of views represented in that project and different use cases, business points of view that makes that project mature very fast. And obviously a lot of contributions going on. And shareability of those models that you have built. Example, detecting COVID from an X-ray. Yeah, we're not sharing the data, but we can share the model. Now that model could be used by any hospital, rural or not, or any other IT organization that wants to provide that as a service to really make a difference in how we are treating patients. So from that perspective, I would say open source is a huge catalyst in driving the innovation forward, and specifically AI ML, making that a reality and making it consumable by the organizations.
Great. And what does a typical engagement look like for someone considering an open source solution with Red Hat?
Yeah, so we essentially would come into your organization and do an interview around the current processes, procedures that have been established. Going back to the point I earlier make about three aspects, do you have the right environment to allow the workflow of continuous improvement, continuous development with AI ML available? And as part of that interview or discovery session, we will identify the processes that are in place. We will also touch about the culture aspect of it, building that community and shareability. And then we'll talk about the data aspect of it, how you're curating the data, is it easily available? And importantly, how you interject the learnings from those models into the workflow. Because remember, clinical reasoning for Red Hat is actually driving the value out of these investments into the workflow. So when the opportunity is there, we capitalize on it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all this insight today. We've been here with Atif Chagtai, Healthcare Market Leader with Red Hat. This is Stephen Wellman with HIMSS TV. Thank you for watching.